this is Rafaela Bonfim here, and we're going to be talking about selecting samples. So, what's about selecting samples? You select samples when you want to find out a certain information about a group, or that we're going to be calling about a population. And the first thing you have to consider is if it's possible or not to collect and analyze data from every possible member of the population, meaning that you cannot even leave one behind. If the answer is yes, and you do actually can research the entire group you're aiming for, you call it a census. And if the answer is no, then you're gonna use sampling techniques to find out this information. So when do you use sample techniques? When it's impossible to survey the entire population, that can be because of budget, time constraints, or because you have a tight deadline. So here's an overview of sampling techniques. There are two types, probability and non-probability. And about the probability, it is when by following a certain rules, you can generalize the results of a sample of the population to the entire population, meaning that by researching just a few members of this population, you can generalize and say that that's the result of the entire population. So this is what you have to follow when using these techniques. You have to identify a suitable sampling frame based on your research questions to meet your objectives. Decide on a suitable sample size. Select the sample techniques and select the sample, and then check if the sample is actually representative. How to identify a suitable sampling frame? So first you have to know who is the population you're actually aiming for. You need to list every case or member of your target population. Why? To ensure that all members have equal chance of being selected and to ensure the representativeness of the total population. You have to make sure that the sampling is not biased. So if you're researching a group of 20 and 30 years old, you have to know, in Amsterdam for instance, you have to know every person between 20 and 30 years old in Amsterdam, and then you can choose randomly who's going to take part. You have to be careful to not generalize beyond your sample. So for instance, if you're sampling teenagers in Amsterdam, your sample is only representative for the teenagers in Amsterdam, and it wouldn't be representative for the teenagers in entire Holland, for instance. So, what about the response rate? It is important to have a high response rate. So, because of the more responses you have, the more representative it is for your group. But of course, there are always cases of non-responses. There are people who refuse to respond for whatever reason. When you're unable to locate the respondent, when the respondent is unable to make contact with you. Besides of non-response, you also have the case of ineligibles. There are members of case that do not meet the research requirements for whatever reason, and you cannot consider those as responding to your research. So how do you deal with those non-responses and ineligibles? We have here an example of how to do that. Let's say you want to research all the employers that have left the company. And you have this number, which is 1035. But you also know that by sampling only 50% of it, you can already generalize for the whole population. So here you have 517. Which 9 are ineligibles, and 311 are researchable. But what happened is that from this sample, you could only actually talk to 147 of it. So here is your total response rate, the 147 that you actually spoke to, divided by the 517, which were your sample group, minus the 9 that you couldn't consider as part of it for whatever reason. And then you have only a sample of 28% of the whole population that you actually wanted. But from this 517, only 311 were reachable. So from this, you actually got 48%, which is the number closer to what you actually wanted in the first place. So by estimating response rates and actual sample size required, increase the sample size according to the response rate. So you already know that some of these people will not be able to participate, so you should make the sample as big as possible to increase that your response rate will be reasonable for your research. You have to ensure that your sample size is large enough to provide you with the necessary confidence. So if you take a look at the formula below, you have more or less an idea of how that's made. And for more information, you can always check the table 7.1 or appendix 3 from the reading book. So what about sample techniques? Sample techniques is different ways that you can get your sample. So you can use simple random, systematic strategies, stratified random, cluster, and which one you're going to choose. You have to consider if it needs to be face-to-face contact, the geographic area over which the population is spread, and the nature of your sampling frame. The simple random sampling is when you select the samples randomly but using the entire list. So in order to use this sample technique, you do need to have entire list of the population. It's very suitable for geographically dispersed area. The systematic sampling is similar to the simple random sampling, but you sample at regular intervals. So you research the same group, but in different time periods. It's faster, and the only thing you have to bear in mind is that the results can be different if you run into cycles. So, for instance, if you're researching students and you're sampling them during the holiday period, the results might be different than any other period, for instance. The stratified random sampling is when you divide the population into groups, depending on criteria you set yourself for this research. So you do the random sampling from each of this group that you divided. Each group must be represented proportionally the population, and disadvantages are that it's longer, expensive, and difficult to explain. It differs from the cluster sampling is because on the cluster, the population is naturally divided itself. So for instance, if you want to sample different age groups and the population is already divided in that, so you don't need to set criteria yourself. So the most stage sampling is the development of the cluster sample. It's more used to overcome problems like geographically dispersed population. It's longer, expensive, and difficult to explain. As you can see on the figure here, it has different phases, and for each phase you have to do. So now we're going to talk about non-probability sampling. You only use non-probability when you cannot use probability. Probability is the best method, but sometimes it's difficult to do so. And then you use non-probability, which is more practical and less expensive. So in practice, it's the most used way, even though it shouldn't be, because it has a lower capacity to generalize the results. It's mostly used in small groups, if specific groups, for instance, if you're doing a case study and then you already have your sample group. The techniques used in the non-probability sampling are quota, purposive, snowball, self-selection, and convenience. The quota is when you assume that that sample represents the population. It is assumed. So the type of stratified sample in which the selection of samples is entirely non-random is less costly and quicker than probabilistic sampling, as I said before. The sample size is normally between 2,000 and 5,000 and is dependent. The usefulness as a means of stratifying the data, the ability of overcome likely variation groups in their availability for interviews. The purpose sampling is the selection of cases by personal judgment. Small samples, it's not considered representative of the populations. So you choose because you want to, the group. The snowball sampling is used when it's difficult to identify members of the desired population. You make initial contacts to identify further contacts. For instance, you take a phone list and then you call all these people, and then you can identify if you can make further contacts with them. It's difficult to make the initial contact. It's homogeneous sampling, induced to bias. You have the self-selection sampling, when you allow each case to identify their desire to take part in the research, publications of the need for cases. For instance, you can put like signs on the university that you're doing this and this research, who wants to be part of it, or you can announce on the internet or whatever. And then these people come to you because they want to be part of the project. And then you collect data from those who respond. And you also have the convenience sampling, selecting haphazardly cases that are easily to obtain for samples. Sample selections process continues until sample size is reached. It's widely used and is subject to bias. I guess that's pretty much it for sampling. Thank you for listening in, and I see you next time.